Thank you for watching The Thought Criminals with your co-host, Rachel Alexander. That's me. I'm a regular contributor to Townhall, and my co-host, Ralph Benko, a regular contributor to Newsmax. He's also a chairman of the Capitalist League, co-author of the Capitalist Manifesto, and co-owner of the 180,000 Facebook group, Capitalist League. So today we are going to talk about the title of our show.
And our new blog site.
And it's also a new site.
The Thought Criminals, yep.
And we're going to tell you how we basically decided on it and why it's appropriate today. There might be a lot of younger viewers out there who aren't familiar with George Orwell's 1984, and some of you older folks could probably use a refresher. So Ralph, I'll let you start out since you're the one who came up with our new blog name.
Yes, well, there's been 5 years ago, there was this thing called political correctness. So if you said certain things that were disapproved of by the progressive elite, it was called politically incorrect. And then about a year or two ago, they invoked this thing called woke or wokeism, in which you thought or said or certain things, then it was offensive in the eyes of the progressive snowflakes. And by the way, I'm not denigrating progressives for being snowflakes. There are plenty of conservative or pseudo-conservative snowflakes out there, again, who are playing the victim card that used to be the property of progressives. And I've been writing over the years now and then, but things have gotten worse. Things have gone from bad to worse, so we're amping it up, Rachel and I. And by the way, Rachel, if you'll call me Clyde, I'll call you Bonnie, as the Thought Criminals.
I don't know, because those were actually guilty of real crime as opposed to.
Okay, so Thought Bonnie and Thought Thought Clyde, something like that. Okay, we'll check it out. The point here is these are just polite euphemisms for something, for the worst thing in the world: totalitarianism. Totalitarianism wants to control everything that we think and say. And George Orwell, in the appendix to 1984, laid it all out. They're trying to diminish what we're able to say so that they can diminish what we're able to think. And therefore, George Orwell in 1984 invented this concept called thought crimes, and invented this concept called the thought police. And all of these thought crimes and thought police are just instrumentalities of Big Brother, and instrumentalities of attempting to put us under complete control. Remember, people, the nationalist conservatives, as they call themselves, the Josh Hawleys of this world, complain about the surveillance state. But in 1984, there was actually a television camera in everybody's house watching you all the time, and a TV screen that was on all the time, broadcasting the propaganda of the state, of the INGSOC, English socialism, the English socialist state. And the recurring leitmotif was Big Brother is watching. That was real totalitarianism. And we are experiencing now a rise of authoritarianism leaning toward totalitarianism all over the world, not least in the United States, and not just with progressives who've been conniving at totalitarian for a long time, but also on people who are masquerading as conservatives, but are really reactionaries and totalitarians who want absolute power and want to be able to tell us what to say and what to think. We, Rachel, you and I, are part of the resistance movement to the totalitarians, and we're calling it out. No longer wokeism, no longer political correctness. We're calling it out for what it is, which is think pol, or thought police, and thought crimes. And we are here creating a node. Right now, the blog, which is at blogspot.com, is under the URL on the lam from the thoughtpolice.com. But our cahoots guy, Bill Collier, our web genius, hated that name, even though I love that name. So the new website that we're going to be setting up for this blog is going to be called thoughtcriminalsrefuge.com. So for all of you who like to do your own thinking, you who like to be heterodox, and by the way, the word heresy derives from the Greek word herete, which means to think for yourself. So those of us who are prepared to commit heresy against the conventional wisdom and against the dogma that is being propounded and the propaganda of the state, okay, are going to have a place, a new, refreshing place to go where they can hang out with fellow thought criminals and actually think independently about the way things really are. To me, this is much edgier and more powerful than the previous name for our show, Reality Check. And so glad to have you here as a fellow thought criminal with the thought police in hot pursuit of us.
Well, and I'd like to bring up a little more background as to how Orwell came up with this whole concept. He based his totalitarian dystopian society on what he was seeing in the Soviet Union as well as Nazi Germany. He just sugarcoated it a little bit more to fit the West. So,
Oh, wait, please. Not fair to George. Okay. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He took dramatic license to supplant the same totalitarian principles from the Soviet Union and from Nazi Germany, which he detested, even though he himself was a sort of democratic socialist. But he just loathed he was horrified by totalitarianism, and he
no, you're missing what I'm saying. When I'm saying sugar-coated, I mean the government sugar-coated in the West in 1984 how it told the people what was going on. So instead of, in communist Russia, everybody knew that you were going to die if you challenged the Politburo. In 1984, you just erased people's names from books and you pretended like they didn't exist. So that's what I mean. He sugar-coated. It wasn't right in your face as Soviet Russia. So, and what I wanted to talk about a little bit is,
by the way, we should actually start reading a bit of 1984 every week, I think, because remember, they tortured him. They found out what his greatest horror was, and they threatened to put rats in a cage over his head to devour him alive until they broke his spirit and got him through this torment and this threat of torture to betray his beloved girlfriend. I mean, there was no sugarcoating there. Orwell was absolutely unflinching in showing just how horrific totalitarians were. So let's go back to the source document again.
Well, I think
right here.
What I'm saying by sugarcoating is I am saying he's applying communist Russia to the West in a way that is more palatable for people in the West. I'm not saying that it's any nicer. I'm sure they were killing as many people proportionately in 1984 as they were. He just described it in a way where it would, happen easier in the West with all these fake words. At least, in Russia, they didn't have this whole vocabulary of, the Ministry of Truth, the Ministry of Peace. There were bits and pieces of it, but it was much more of a facade in 1984. And what I want to get into is the comparisons to today. And you've already just brought up one where you said, they tortured this poor guy in the very end, Winston Smith. Well, today we are seeing the vestiges of this creep into society today. And a clear example right there is how when the left wants to come after someone using, say, the Department of Justice and put them away in a horrible prison for years and years and break them down, that is the beginnings of this happening here. And, the other thing you've already brought up and talked about is how there are things we're not allowed to think and we're obviously not allowed to say. And so we are starting to see that in terms of, say, one of our videos was censored from YouTube. It was a completely normal video. We were just discussing a news piece that I had written, and that got banned from YouTube. So the comparisons to today are they're overwhelming, they're growing. It might not, and it's not necessarily, okay, the government yet, but it's this sneaky way that's coming in where you've got all, free speech in society is pretty much all controlled by big tech. They all have this left-wing dominant position. They get into control of the government. And so they put all that stuff in. And someday I actually want to do an article showing how, you think you've got these big companies that are private, but in reality, the government is always pulling strings saying, okay, we'll give you this tax credit if you implement this doctrination or you implement this. So these aren't solely private companies anymore. I wouldn't call them necessarily quasi-government, but they are under so much control from government that you can't stand there and say, oh, let Google do whatever he wants. It's a private company. No, Google is already subject to all these US regulations and rules that people don't even grasp the level, the depth of.
Well, that's one of those areas that we can agree to disagree on, Rachel, because I believe that the big digital companies are private companies who are attempting to curate according to standards that they believe are consistent with decency. And yes, when you're trying to curate 2 billion people like Facebook, then some will, there will be mistakes made, low level, so hopefully corrected. But I, the second most conservative man in the world, have put together 183,000 followers on Facebook without an incident and without censoring myself and without flinching from, taking on socialism, communism, and collectivism and fighting, the good fight for free markets and free enterprise and for capitalism.
But
right
our
out.
Our video's already been censored by YouTube. I mean, it's already affecting you.
It was not censored. It was curated because we hit a tripwire, and I think it probably had something to do with the pandemic, which they're very, very sensitive about.
Now, when we were talking about election integrity.
Oh, or maybe election integrity, right? And voter fraud. Maybe it was something like that. But these are. I watched them very closely. I wrote the most prestigious cult classic book on web-based advocacy over 10 years ago, the Webster's Dictionary, How to Use the Web to Transform the World, which got a worldwide prize in Paris, France. So I've been watching this stuff very closely. And you know what? My own view is that while they're not perfect, they do a very fine job of curating their material, not to truckle to the government, but essentially because they're trying to protect their brand against things that their advertisers would find offensive, which is what any big company does. And yes, are there things I disagree with in their standards? Are there things I disagree with in their practices? Sure, but I don't accuse them of censorship, and I do not accuse them of being puppets of the government. They are very lightly regulated, as is perfectly appropriate for essentially First Amendment entities. But look, I'd rather talk about what we agree about rather than what we disagree about, and that is there is creeping. I think I'm hoping that we can nip it in the bud, but there is an alarming, growing sense of menace in the world from both the progressives and the fake right, the KINOs, conservatives in name only, the reactionaries who are attempting to steal the conservative brand, that are dogmatic, that are totalitarian, and that are brutal. And this is not just in the United States.
I don't see them, locking people up. I don't see them going after and prosecuting people wrongly. I don't think these conservatives in name only that you're talking about are as bad as you say they are, because I don't see their totalitarian impulses. And I know you want to move on, but I just have to point out, I disagree that these big techs, censorship is such a small deal. When you have people like former New York Times reporter Alex Berenson being banned from Twitter, okay? He's not a right-wing firebrand. He is a completely, person from the MSM. all the people, half the people I used to love to follow on Twitter, they're all gone. They've all been banned. And, it's a nightmare trying to go to Telegram or wherever else, Parlor, trying to find these people and get their information. I mean, it's just destroyed them. And so, no, I think this is a huge problem. I think the big tech censorship is very scary. I think it's just going to get worse. And I think our own show is eventually going to be kicked off of YouTube.
Well, Rachel, I just want to stipulate the one thing, and that is when you have unmediated content, when you have anarchy, you get 4chan and 8chan, and you get absolute you get absolute vile stuff. I've seen it. I've moderated. I moderated Team Sarah, and I hired Bill to moderate Team Sarah because we were getting trolled and slammed with snuff videos and porn and other things that was designed to offend our membership under a false flag. They pretended to be members, and also to discredit us in the eyes of the establishment media. We were able to track them down to places like the Democracy Underground and other layers of these vicious slanderers, and to back them off, to take screenshots and to prove that we were being invaded. So I'm just saying it's more complicated than you think, and people who are curating the content of their sites to eliminate hate speech and to eliminate dangerous speech, things having to do with whether it's egging people on to riot, whether it's BLM, Black Lives Matters, or whether it's the January 6th rioters.
No. They are not doing the same to the left, okay? The equivalent of 4chan out there on the left is getting away with it. And I give you a very clear example. There are tens of thousands of members of multiple face groups out there which are dedicated to nothing but canceling people on the right, okay? I've been a victim of that. They came after me, and that's how I found out about them. And Facebook does nothing to shut these horrible groups out. They are sitting there getting one person fired after another on the right, and nobody is doing a thing about it. So big tech is just getting worse. They're censoring conservatives, and they're letting the left run free. And I don't see this getting any better. I don't see anything changing.
Well, according to a study that I just read, Twitter leans right. And according to a lot that I've read, there are Facebook leans libertarian. And Google is just a way of finding stuff. So I think it's I am very queasy about your idea of putting the government in charge of what
When did I say put the government in charge? You're putting words in my mouth.
Regulating them.
I never even said that. The main thing I want with big tech is I think a little person like me should be able to sue big tech for defamation. Okay, that's pretty much all I've really thought and come up with.
That would shut down social media once and for all.
No,
because thousands of people would be suing them all the time for things they didn't say. So if Mark Zuckerberg defames you, heck yes, go after him, hammer and tongue, sue him for $40 billion. Okay, but if some wackadoodle posts something mean about you, then your ability to sue Mark Zuckerberg would just completely, they'd be awash with lawsuits, and a
jury would throw it out if they saw how ridiculous it was. Okay, hey, look, Facebook isn't being unfair editorialized.
You're making a different point, okay, and I like the point that you're making. So hush up and let me point out the great point you're making. You want more censorship, not less censorship.
What do you mean by censorship? Do you mean private censorship?
I'm using your word. I'm using your word. When you say big tech censors, and you want more censorship with all of these private groups that are going out and canceling people like you. You just said, and I agree with you, that Facebook should suppress that. that is a violation of fairness, and that's a violation of community standards. And I agree that wouldn't call it censorship. I would call it moderation. They should up their game. And when people are conducting digital lynch mobs, Facebook should shut them down, whether they're going after innocent people on the right or innocent people on the left, okay? Or even when it's just mob rule, whether innocent or guilty or whatever it happens to be. So I'm agreeing with you, Rachel. And the thing, what I'd like you to do is to dedicate your column and dedicate your intellectual conservative website, and to use your vast network of your vast Rachel Alexander conspiracy to bring pressure on Facebook to up its standards and to work harder to eliminate abuses that any reasonable person, not that I'm reasonable, but a reasonable person like you could point to online, and rather than criticizing that they're censoring, simply say their standards and practices need to be improved, they need to moderate better, and they need to moderate more fairly, so that innocent people like you and even guilty people like me do not end up getting assaulted by the digital mob rule and having our lives and our careers hurt or even ruined in some cases. So,
okay.
can I agree with you about that?
Fair enough, but people have been complaining about this kind of stuff with Facebook for several years now, and nothing has happened. And I want to clarify one thing. Don't go putting words in my mouth. When I say that Facebook, should do something about these groups, I didn't necessarily say completely shut them down, but what I think needs to happen is crimes need to be looked into, because when you falsely put a witch hunt after somebody, like say Jussie Smollett, that's a classic example. He's now being prosecuted for that.
I'm sorry.
There must be the ability.
Who's Justin Smollett?
Justin Smollett. Okay, I wrote an article how I was Jussie Smolletted after the left came after me in those Facebook groups.
Wait, when was this article? What was the name of it? Where did you publish it? And give us a quick summary of it. What did they do to you?
The article came out on, I think, June 24th of 2020. And basically I talked about how Jussie Smollett, who is an actor, faked a hate crime.
Oh, that one. He claimed, yes, I remember who that was. He's a black actor from something or other. And he went to the police and claimed that he'd been attacked, assaulted, or something like that by some conservative.
Well, he said it was white Trump supporters, when in reality it was two black men from Africa.
It was completely fabricated. He did it as a publicity stunt and as a way of attempting to smear our reputation. It's a crime to make a false police report.
Right, and he's still being prosecuted. So my point is that kind of behavior can be policed by Facebook, and they can shut it down that way. Put out a few examples of, hey, look, look what we did to these people. They're completely banned from Facebook or whatever else. And a lot of people are going to stop engaging in that behavior. So I just want fairness. Groups like that, they need to be called out. If Facebook's going to go after all the, pro-Trump people and ban them for things, then they need to use equivalent.
They need to go after the pro-Biden people then too, just to be even-handed and fair, right?
No, I'm just talking about
I'm teasing. Look, I think we finally reached agreement, but I also want to switch back to the thought criminals before we wrap up. And that is, you're not asking for the government to dictate, including the courts, what we can and cannot do, but you are demanding, and quite properly, if I'm hearing you right, finally, that Facebook up its game and start having better, clearer, more transparent and fair community standards, and invest whatever it needs to invest in order to clean that place up and to prevent the bullying of innocent people based upon their ideology, whether it's conservative or progressive or whatever it happens to be. So do we agree that Facebook really needs to be pressured by the marketplace, by people like its users, people like you and me, to do a better job moderating its site?
Well, of course, that's a no-brainer. You and me as free market conservatives, of course we want that. The question is whether that's enough to make it happen. And, maybe there are other free market solutions. Maybe if all of us, people on the right really boycotted Facebook. I mean, but the problem is something like that is probably not feasible. I mean, I don't know about you, but I do need Facebook in my career. I mean,
I do too. And it's also, there aren't enough of us to make a difference in their advertising revenue. We're maybe a few 100,000 out of billions, out of multiple billions. That said, they are sensitive to being, they are sensitive to social pressure. Okay. Mark Zuckerberg is very emphatic that he wants to be bringing people together. He also wants free speech. He's young. He's what, 30 or something like that, 35. So far as I can tell, if we raise our voices loudly and intelligently enough and consistently enough, not playing the victim card, but demanding him as a matter of honor, as a matter of good citizenship, that he bear down on eliminating the abuses, which means hiring more moderators, which costs them money, but so what? In order to preserve his brand, he's got to do that. And if he really wants to be the father of the metaverse, which it sure looks like he wants to, then now is a really good time for people like you and me and our millions of listeners to be raising their voices, writing letters to the editor, writing their commenting on Facebook, putting comments on Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook account and whatever. I believe that they are very attentive. Actually, I have reason to know that they're very attentive to public opinion. And so we just need to make our opinions known forcefully and intelligently. And we want them to raise their standards of moderation so that innocent people are not getting bullied thanks to Facebook.
Well, I don't know if that's going to be enough, but I don't want to be Debbie Downer, so I will remain optimistic that might be all there is. We need to fix the solution. And on that note, I think we can wrap this up, and we hope that we've enlightened our viewers a little bit about 1984 and why we're named the thought criminals. And stick around. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.